Hey everyone, welcome back to Critical Faculty. Today we're going to talk about a bit of science with a hint of philosophy and psychology. Today I've got the founding publisher of Skeptic magazine, the host of the podcast, Skeptic, also teaches Chapman University, Skepticism 101, and have been for 18 years a monthly columnist for the Scientific American. Please welcome Dr. Michael Shermer. Hello, Dr. Michael Shermer. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us for the second time. But today we're going to talk about something maybe a little bit more profound, because it has been a difficult, or claimed to be a difficult topic for a lot of philosophers, such as David Chalmers down under here in Australia, calling it the hard problem of consciousness. Do you think it is a hard problem?
Well, I think it's a ill-conceived problem. That is to say, it's a conceptual problem, or a problem with our concepts. That is, it's phrased in a way that it can't be answered. That is, what is it like to experience something is necessarily an internal subjective experience that can't be shared by somebody else. There's no way the little homunculus in your head can tiptoe over into mine to see if the red in my head looks like the red in your head and then make a comparison. So when you say, what do we mean by consciousness? We mean what it's like to be something. That's kind of the traditional definition. Famously, what's it like to be a bat, or you could say dolphin, or any other species, or any other person, really. The other problem of other minds, what's it like to be somebody else? How do you know you're not the only one who's conscious and everybody else is a philosophical zombie? That's kind of where all these discussions go. And I don't see any way you could get around that, because it's not possible to answer it when it's phrased that way. And I think really it's just going to turn out to be an emergent property of complex systems that from the bottom up scale up into more complexity, and until at some point, I don't want to say the lights come on, because that's, again, it's kind of deceptive to say it that way, as if it's a light switch. And you have the problem of the heap. What's a heap? Once you've defined it, 10,000 grains of sand, well, is 9,999 grains of sand a heap? Well, yeah, of course it is. Well, okay, so then is 1 grain of sand a heap? No. Okay, so at some point you just draw the line, and the heap grows gradually, grain by grain. And same thing with brains. There's no point where you're going to say, well, we have 85 billion neurons, but at 84 billion, are you not conscious? What about 83 billion? What about 64.5 billion? Yeah, in other words, it's not going to be a light switch. It's just going to be more like a dimmer switch, where sentience and consciousness comes on a little more with each layer of neural networks and so forth, such that all animals to a certain extent are conscious. But you just have degrees of consciousness or complexity in the brain that corresponds with it. And, so to me, I think it's just going to end up being, neural nets on top of neural nets on top of neural nets, and, maps, cognitive maps that map other maps that map maps. And you get a kind of a meta mapping. And at some point, there's just an awareness of one's own consciousness. And then, that's the answer. That's it. And I was just reading Neil Seth's new book called Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, it's called. And he actually argues, and I like this argument, that we're in the position on the hard problem of consciousness like biologists were more than a century ago about the hard problem of life. How do you explain living organisms? What makes them alive? You have a dog that's just, bouncing around, everything's fine, and the next moment it's dead. Well, the parts are all still there, just, 1 second later or 1 minute later, whatever, then, it's no longer conscious. Where'd the consciousness go? The parts are all still there. And so at the time, people speculated on an elan vital, this kind of life force, as if it's kind of some metaphysical ether that's floating around in the body or something. Nobody talks about the elan vital anymore. We just quit talking about it because life just emerges from biochemistry and all the processes that go on in the body, in the brain, and so on. And I think this is Seth's argument that this is the way that the hard problem of consciousness is going to go. It's never going to be solved. We're going to just quit talking about it once we have a pretty viable theory of how the brain works, and then it'll just be obvious. Consciousness is just an emergent property of all these systems operating, just like life is.
Very interesting. So, do you think then consciousness is sort of akin to some sort of evolution? It didn't start immediately. It didn't start like out of a sudden 300,000 years ago in Homo sapiens, and before that, animals were just walking pack of meat and muscles, and suddenly
Right.
consciousness emerges. But it's something more like the eye, where just this little slit that detects the light, and then it becomes the eyes of the octopus, which are a lot better than ours. So it's something that happens suddenly. And do you think it might then get even better? Do you think that as the prefrontal lobe cortex get bigger or more efficient, something might happen?
If something more, you mean? If it did, which it's not, then yeah, something more. Well, so that brings up a deeper issue still, the kind of Mysterian mysteries. That is to say, perhaps our understanding of the universe and everything in it is limited by the size of our brain and the structure of the cortex and how we can think given the hardware we have and so on. What if we had brains twice the size that we have, primarily the cortex, or 10 times or 100 times? Would we have a different understanding of the cosmos? And I suspect probably, but but what do I know? Because I don't have a brain that big. Nobody does. So we don't know for sure, but I suspect that that's probably the case. My dog has a pretty big brain, but not nearly as big as any primate. And so, his understanding of the world is understandably limited by his neural networks and the hardware that's running in there. So you would think so, but as I said at the outset there, that's not happening. Actually, our brains have gotten a little bit smaller over the last 10,000 years. If you look at Neanderthal brains from 300,000 years ago, skulls, they're bigger than ours today. Yeah. So it's not just brain size. I think it's brain complexity. Once you reach a certain size, I mean, dolphins have massive brains, but of course they have pretty big bodies, but not out of proportion to ours necessarily. And whales have even huger brains, but they have huge bodies to run. You make those adjustments, and there's no reason to think that cetaceans, along with most of all the great apes, let's say, except for maybe gibbons, have some kind of consciousness, some kind of sentience. They have to. And if they don't, then you'd have to say, well, no one else does either, and I'm the only one who's conscious because I'm aware of it, and everybody else is a philosophical zombie walking around that just looks like the lights are on, but they're not. Something like that. So, by the way, I refute that argument with the Copernican principle that I'm not special. The Copernican principle is we're not special. So you apply it to yourself, you're not special. And so if you see somebody experiencing emotions similar to the way you act when you experience that emotion, there's a pretty good bet that they're having the same internal experience that you have when you have that emotion. Because why would it be otherwise? We all have pretty much the same neural wiring in terms of how it works, neurotransmitter substances across synaptic gaps and so on. There's no reason to think that, I'm special and I have some other kind of brain that no one else has. So I think given that, again, the hard problem will just go away, along with, what's it like to be a bat or anything else. And by the way, people have challenged that. You kind of get an idea of what it's like to be a bat. If you put yourself in a little closet blindfolded and you just make sounds, you can kind of tell where the walls are from the sounds you're making. And that would give you just a little bit, maybe a 1% sense of, well, that must be what bats are like. They can kind of tell where the walls are by bouncing sound off them, something like that.
Very interesting. Just a quick comment and a followed by question then. The size of the brain, yes, the Neanderthal, I think it was 1750 and Homo sapiens were about 1500 centimeters.
On average. It's a
yeah, on average. But the human brains, apparently, it's actually reducing in the last few decades. I think we lost about 5 to 10%, but we're not losing efficiency. The IQ is going up as time goes by, like a collective one. So that's quite interesting. It's like the brain is learning to be a bit more efficient, considering it's the organ that is taking most of the calories per day. So the trade-off here in evolution, because it's very costly to have a brain, especially as it gets bigger, but it looks like it's learning to be more efficient.
Yeah, again, we shouldn't get too hung up on size. Once you reach a certain size, it doesn't really matter. It's the wirings, the networks, it's how they're put together that matters. It's not at all clear just because Neanderthals had bigger brains than ours that they could have done quantum physics or something like that. Who knows? Maybe they could have, but maybe not. It's not just brain size. That's kind of an old idea, dating back, say, 2 centuries, that this size of the brain determines intelligence and that sort of thing. Clearly, that's not the case. Women have smaller brains than men on average, but they have smaller bodies on average. So, and yet their IQ scores are on average the same as men's. And there's women are better at some things, men are better at other things. There's no difference there really on average. So it's not just brain size. It's way more than that.
I think the problem is still persistent because having a very high IQ doesn't guarantee you're successful in life. Still to date, you can be quite useless socially or something.
Yes, I mean, the point is always made. Like, for example, if you're a medical doctor, everybody who's a medical doctor that gets into medical school, they're all smart. They all have IQs 130 and up, 2 standard deviations above the mean. But some are way more successful than others. So it's not just being smart, that kind of smart. The kind of smart that could pass SATs and then MCATs and those kinds of tests and get good grades. There's a lot more to it than that, right? A lot. And, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, and multiple intelligences, being good at other things. And, maybe spatial reasoning is better here and verbal reasoning is better for that job. And, these kind of IQ tests, general scores, although they correlate pretty well with success on average, predicting who in the law profession or medical profession or science profession is going to succeed. You're not going to get that out of any of these tests.
Right. One thing that's sort of on the side of consciousness that might somehow, because we know it's in the brain, it has to be in the brain.
Yeah. Although there is, extended, the kind of embodied cognition. This kind of counters the mind uploading idea that you don't need a body, you just have your connectome uploaded to the cloud. Well, no, you actually need your body. Our consciousness very much extends through our entire body, and it's not just a brain. A brain in a vat's not going to do it, where you trick it by stimulating it. None of this can be done, but just in science fiction. No, you actually need a body. So the only way to do that really is the cryonics people for immortality, where your body is still intact and you just reawaken it, however that would be done in some future state, and cure the thing that killed you. That would really be the only way to continue this kind of continuity of self, because if you scan somebody's brain, and again, this can't be done at the moment, but let's say you could, and you got the entire connectome and you upload it to the cloud. Well, now there's 2 of you because you're still alive. If we scan your brain, say in an MRI, a functional MRI, and upload it, now there's 2 of you, and then maybe make copies of that. But really, that's only you at that particular moment, because you are not just a snapshot of you at this moment. You're going to change in the next 5 minutes, the next 5 hours, the next 5 days, 5 years, and so on. And you're different now than you were 5 years ago, and so on. So any copy, the moment it became alive and started leading its own existence, it's going to have a different life pattern than you are and now it's like twins. No twins don't think of themselves as, well, there's a copy of me and that's actually me over there. They don't think that. They each think that they're their own unique autonomous sentient being, and there's no confusion in their minds about that.
Wow, that's really interesting. It's almost like the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics, the many words of interpretation. You're constantly making copies of yourself.
Every moment. Well, if that was true, yeah, that's right. That would be the case.
That is really interesting.
So the idea, the definition of the self would have to change if there were multiple copies of you. But again, the point is that even if there were identical copies of you, including all your memories, all the way up to this moment, well, going forward, you're going to have different experiences, and your self will be slightly different. And so that's not actually you anymore. That's a different person.
Yeah. Well, kind of follows with the law of identity. A is always going to be A. It cannot be anything else but itself. Very interesting. Yeah, the analogy, I completely agree with the brain thing, because a CPU on a shelf, it's still a CPU. It's not a full computer until it's connected and does its job. Else, it's just a CPU sitting on a shelf. It won't be called.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like Data on Star Trek. It's, of course, it's an actor playing Data and crosses across the uncanny valley there, and we have no problems thinking of Data as an intelligent, sentient robot, but that's not actually what AIs would be like. They aren't like that. They just sit there like a lump on a log until you give them something to do. The hardware by itself is not going to do it. You have to have some kind of programming. It's like the analogy I make with Watson, the IBM computer that won Jeopardy, or even Big Blue that beat Gary Kasparov in chess. I mean, these are machines. They don't even know they're playing Jeopardy or playing chess. They don't think, oh boy, I beat Gary Kasparov, the greatest chess player ever. Now I'm the number one. They don't even know that they're playing chess. They don't know anything. It's just the hardware, grinding through algorithms. And so, that's so the kind of computer programming we've mostly had is not going to get us to an understanding of human consciousness. Now, maybe something more like deep learning programs in AI is going to come closer to human consciousness. But I still think we're a long ways from figuring that out, how to make a sentient, conscious computer.
Yeah. And last question on that topic before we move to the free will situation. As an evolutionary sort of a trick, do you think organisms, species, beings that are self-aware, the qualia, which is consciousness, have better chance of surviving than those who have limited consciousness or only limited to awareness and the middle brain? They don't have a developed prefrontal lobe cortex?
No, not at all. I mean, most organisms have either no brains, they just have nothing, just, bacteria, single cell organisms, they survive just fine. Or just, scale up from there, some simple organisms that just have a little nodule, cluster of neurons that runs the body, they have no sentience, no consciousness at all, and they do just fine. So there's nothing inevitable about big brains. We shouldn't expect that on every planet that we explore with the new James Webb telescope, say. Although the most we're going to be able to find there are, chemical signatures in the atmospheres of living organisms. But let's say, just for example, that we could find life on other planets. There's nothing to say that that consciousness is going to and intelligence is going to evolve. It's not inevitable. In fact, it's pretty rare. Just look at the N of 1 of life on Earth that's evolved. Billions and billions of species. Very few of them have big brains. And, only the primates and cetaceans have, disproportionately large brains for the size of their bodies. And only one has, symbolic language, our species. So, 10 billion experiments and only one succeeded, barely. We could have gone extinct 120,000 years ago or whatever. When you look at it that way, that doesn't seem to be anything particularly inevitable or progressive or, a directed unfolding of, laws of nature to lead to us. There's nothing like that as I see it.
Not many people
just
know that
lucky.
we were down to a few thousands, 120,000 years ago, and we barely
Yeah,
we just
yeah.
made it.
Well, some argue that if it wasn't for us, then maybe Neanderthals would be having this conversation, or they'd have the internet and electric cars and smartphones and whatever. I don't know, maybe, but maybe not. Again, their tools don't show a massive progress, cultural progress over hundreds of thousands of years that they had Europe before Homo sapiens arrived. It doesn't look to me like there's anything inevitable about an unfolding of higher consciousness or self-awareness or intelligence.
Well, they haven't completely gone, because apparently we still have 2% of their DNA. Even Africans now
That's
found.
right.
So we still have something. Maybe the introverts of the world are, because they were not known for their social skills.
Well, they had slightly smaller social groups, but they lived in social groups. They had to have reasonably complex social cognition to navigate those worlds. Not that different from Homo sapiens. It isn't clear what caused the extinction of Neanderthals. It may not have been a catastrophic event or anything like we drove them into extinction. It could just be a slightly different rate of breeding and maintaining or expanding a population, and they may just have died out slowly. It could have happened over thousands of years, and in the fossil record, that looks like it happened pretty sudden. But thousands of years is that's not sudden on human.
I'm thinking I'd hate to be a Neanderthal female, because with the size of the brain, probably bigger size of the heads, birth would have not been a piece of cake.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So now we think we've got consciousness, and we can navigate life.
We're conscious. It's okay to. It's okay
the qualia sort of tells us that. But now we move into the other situation. You go into the ice cream parlor, and you're faced with the original example of the vanilla and chocolate, and you choose vanilla over chocolate. You have no idea why. You've always liked vanilla, but you have no idea why. But you're choosing. You think you're choosing. You're acting as if you're choosing. Is that good enough?
Well, it's a subjective sense of free will. It's a useful fiction, you might say, or it feels like you're making a choice. So why not assume you are making choices and hold yourself accountable, and society can hold you morally culpable for your actions and all that stuff. But that still concedes to the determinist that there's no such thing. It's all an illusion. But by calling it a useful fiction, you're saying it's a fiction, it doesn't exist. Well, I disagree with that, because I think that let's take Dan Dennett's idea of degrees of freedom in an evolutionary scale of brains and bodies that are more or less complex, and they have more or fewer choices as they move about their world. And maybe a single cell bacteria has very few degrees of freedom. It can move left or right, up or down. It follows chemical gradients toward nutrients or not, so on. Okay, so that's a pretty limited organism, but you just scale up to more complex organisms that have more degrees of freedom. And at some point you get to us, where we're not just pinballs bouncing around our world wondering what's going to happen next. We're actually actively involved in the causal net of the universe. We can change it. You can decide, well, you know what? I'm not going to have the vanilla anymore. I'm going for chocolate now. Now, of course, the determinist would say even that was determined. Well, okay, but at some point, when you're moving about your day, you're making choices that could have been different. So this idea that you couldn't have done different. Yes, you can. You could have done different under the same circumstances, or at least very close to it. So in my model, the universe is not predetermined. So for many determinists, the universe is unfolding in an inevitable way from the Big Bang. It was determined, 13.8 billion years ago, that you and I would have this conversation and say the exact words we're saying, because the particles in the universe, if you could know them, Laplace's demon that knows every particle in the universe and all motions and so forth, taking discounting quantum effects that kind of get washed out and canceled at the macro level. So let's just set that aside. Excuse me. And but most a great many scientists don't think that the universe is predetermined. That there's a certain level of not just randomness, but the active engagement of organisms in the world to change the future is a kind of volition. It's a kind of freedom. It's what Dan Dennett calls the freedom free will worth having, or volition worth having. He calls it elbow room. There's a little elbow room in there so if you're aware of the causal vectors pinging on you and moving you in one direction or another, you can change that by tweaking the variables in your future self and saying, well, I know that tomorrow I'm going to act this way, or I'm going to want that. So today I'm going to change the conditions such that when I get up tomorrow morning, it's going to be different than it would be if I hadn't tweaked the variables. Well, what's that? Who is doing that? I am. Well, why am I doing that? Because I want a different outcome. So look, again, the determinists will say even that was determined, and so on all the way. It's just determinants all the way down. Okay. Well, here again, I think we're bumping up against a conceptual problem that is a problem with the concepts of determinism and free will. Most scientists and philosophers don't believe in a little homunculus free will, a libertarian free will, not to be confused with the political position. That most reject that, and they say, okay, so this compatibilism. So the universe is determined. Yeah, okay, we live in a determined universe, but it's not predetermined. And so that causal net, we're part of that causal net, and we can change it as we go forward. That's as good as it can get. In any case, what difference does it make? Because you don't feel like you're determined. You feel like you're free. So why not act as if you are and make moral choices, make smart choices, because that is what you are doing.
Yeah, no, I'm a compatibilist myself, so I do agree with you. You'll drive yourself insane thinking about these topics. But I'm gonna borrow from quantum mechanics here. Could free will be almost like a superposition, a situation where things are in superposition, and only upon reflecting, it's like the observer then.
Yeah, maybe metaphorically, although quantum physics people tell me that for the most part those effects wash out at the macro level. We live in a large universe here, not at the subatomic scale. So as far as I know, that those kinds of effects do not apply to what you and I are doing right now. There's some debate there, but I don't think so.
I know you would think so. Sean Carroll, quite love his work, but he's pushing the Everett interpretation, where the entanglement situation, and he reckons we become entangled as we observe. That's why we affect the test of changing the particle from wave to becomes a particle, and because we become entangled in the system ourselves in the act of observation.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
it's up for debate. Yeah, it's up for debate. This one here, it's where we don't know.
Right. I think he wrote about that in his book. The Big Picture, is that what it was called?
Yeah. It was.
Yeah, I thought that was a good. Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, Sean, he's a determinist as a scientist, but I think he's a compatibilist on the free will issue, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. Just at some point, it's just like, okay, let's just stop talking about this issue, because it can't be resolved based on the words that we're using. Here, you got to invoke Wittgenstein and his analysis of how language restricts how we can think about the world. And so if by free will you mean this and by determinism you mean that, then how can they ever be resolved? So somebody asks here, how do we punish bad behavior without punishing people who didn't choose to be bad? Well, okay, so here it's good. That's a good question. Here it's good to make a distinction between, big obvious limitations on controlling one's behavior, brain damage to the prefrontal cortex that keeps behavior in check, as acting as kind of a governor, or extreme drug addiction, things like that, just a horrible upbringing or some brain damage, a tumor, those kinds of people are already accounted for in the law. This is like, the kind of insanity defense, or, my upbringing made me do it, something like that. And we recognize that at least for some people, that's the case. But for most of us, most of us don't have brain tumors. Most of us don't have horrible backgrounds that completely wrecked our ability to control our behavior and follow social norms and customs and laws and so on. Most of us do this most of the time. And when we don't, we should be held accountable for it. So again, it's not black and white. Let's get away from a binary way of thinking about these issues, that it's a spectrum, it's a continuum. And, think of it as a big fuzzy set. And most of us are in the big fuzzy set, in which, for the most part, we're making choices and should be held accountable for our choices. On the edges, we're kind of fuzzes into some other category of mental illness or addiction or brain disease or tumor or whatever. There we can allow for, not punishing people for something they didn't choose to be. Now, the determinists would say it's tumors all the way down. It's, no one ever chooses to be bad. No, that's not the case. I disagree with that. I think, in the middle of the fuzzy set of normal people, they do make choices. They know I could do this, but I shouldn't do that. Now that's a slightly separate question from prison, prison reform or criminal justice reform, which I think does need to happen, because much of the criminal justice system is based on kind of an Old Testament and a religious idea that people are sinners and they should be punished for their sin. I do think that's not a useful model, that approaching it like a behaviorist, like a behavioral economist, or choice architecture, where you want to adjust the parameters to nudge the person to do the right thing after you let them out. Get a job, be responsible. Don't, go back to the old gang and stay away from drugs and, things like that most of us learn pretty early. Most of us do know those things. And again, the person that just doesn't, there's lots of examples of this in criminal cases. But the law does deal with those already. So, I think moving toward restorative justice, that is, well, let's fix what's wrong with this person through education and programs and so on. And let's restore the harm done to the victims of this person's crimes. That is not done at all in the criminal justice system. The state is the arbiter here, and the state doesn't really care about the victim in terms of what they lost. It's not their job to, make sure that the perpetrator, let's say after being found guilty, restores the harm done. They don't do that. That's civil. That's the civil justice system, where you have to, file a lawsuit against the perpetrator, even if they're in prison, and see if you can get assets from their bank account, or if they go back to work, that you can get some of their salary to compensate for the harm that they did. But the state doesn't do that. You have to do that privately.
Yeah, well, I do agree. Even though we're improving a little bit and moving away from the revenge, the 600 years ago, that image of a person tied to a stake and people sort of throwing eggs and onions on them, and sometimes sit alight, and then abolishing the death penalty in so many countries. I think we're heading in the right direction, but I think I'm in agreement with you. We need to still improve on this, bearing in mind that. Even if these people don't choose, even if you're deterministic, their actions still have repercussions on other people physically, other than yourself, and therefore you can't at least you take away their freedom, so they will stop doing what they're doing to society and other people, as a minimum step. Just slightly back to the consciousness here, because a couple of comments, and it reminded me of Roger Penrose, because there's some suggestion that consciousness is even greater than what we think. It's at a fundamental level in the universe. Would that bear any weight?
Yeah. It's an interesting idea. and Deepak Chopra thinks about this in kind of a Western Buddhism way, that consciousness, you're not going to find it in the brain. It's not in there. It's everywhere. It's it's the, as he say it, the ground of all being. You can't just drill down and in the quantum field you find consciousness. It's everywhere, and that all of physical existence is a manifestation of this conscious field. Okay, well, maybe, but to me, the fact that when a part of the brain is destroyed, it dies, tumor, injury, whatever, the function that it had is gone. So as I like to ask Deepak, where does Aunt Millie's mind go when it dies of dementia or just dementia, senility? We know what happens. The neurons die. And once the neurons are dead, the memories just fade. The personality disappears. Where'd it go? If it was some sort of field and floating around in the ether or the quantum field or something like that, why does it need the hardware? And their answer is, well, it's like a radio station broadcasting signals into the room here, and I don't see them, but if I have a radio here and I turn the radio on, then I can detect the signals that are here. Okay, so the brain, you have to have a brain to detect the consciousness field that's out there. Well, but I know where the radio signals come from. They come from radio stations, and I can pinpoint on the map where they're located, and I can go there and see for myself that they're broadcasting. That my little radio set can pick up. What's the equivalent of that for consciousness? Who is the consciousness broadcaster in the universe? And there is no answer to that. It's just like, well, it just always was. Okay. Well, at some point we just hit a epistemological wall. We can't know anything more about that. So I'd say that's probably pretty unlikely. I just had on my podcast John Joe McFadden. He wrote a book about Occam's razor and simplicity in scientific theories, but he also has another paper on his theory of solving the hard problem of consciousness. He claims that it's in electromagnetic fields, so it's a fields theory, and that fields are real, and that the EEG measuring your consciousness on your scalp, it's measuring these electromagnetic fields that are generated by neurons in the brain, and that's where consciousness exists, in these kind of unified fields of lots of neural networks firing in patterns and so on. Anyway, I haven't read the paper too carefully yet. He just sent it to me, and there might be something to it, but again, it could be, and Seth is right, that there is no solution to the hard problem of consciousness. We'll just quit talking about it at some point.
Folks, just have put there Dr. Shermer's podcast, which is fantastic. I follow it myself quite avidly, and it varies from topics of different authors with books discussing ideas from psychology to science, physics, everything. Would you like to tell us a little bit about it, Dr. Shermer?
Well, the podcast, yeah. So it's called the Michael Shermer Show, and original, huh? And so my primary thing is talking to authors about their new books. So there aren't many podcasts that do this. In fact, I don't know of any that focus on nonfiction books in science, history, philosophy, economics, politics, and so on. And it kind of evolved out of a public science lecture series that I used to host at Caltech. And then, we started doing live events, and then the pandemic. So it's like there's no more live events. So let's just go. Now the podcast technology is there. It's easy to do. And instead of flying a guest out from wherever they live to LA and having put them up in a hotel and order physical books, we just do it all online. And here, these are conversations that I would love to have with these authors if they were just at my house. Like, I'm going to have dinner with so-and-so. Let's talk about your book, and let's talk about other stuff. And like this one that came out today with John Joe McFadden. We start off talking about history of science and William of Occam and Occam's razor and simplicity and what does that mean? And the next thing you know, we're talking about consciousness and free will and, just pretty much everything under the sun, immortality. And it's like, this is the kind of conversations I would be having if he came over to my house for dinner. So it's a fun kind of experience for me, and I think for listeners. We have, I don't know, about 100,000 people a week listen to the podcast. So got a ways to go before we reach the Joe Rogan stage of, whatever, however many millions he gets. But it's to me, it's an interesting project to, broadcast people's ideas that they put in books in a different medium. I like audiobooks and print books, and well, how about we talk about the book for hours if you like. And also as an author myself, it's, doing media is kind of frustrating. Most mainstream media, you just get six minutes, maybe 3 minutes, at most maybe 10 minutes. Well, here I go hour and a half, 2 hours, sometimes 2.5 hours, just depends. And there's no hard out, and people can talk about whatever they want. And it's fun to get to know who they are. What's your origin story? Where'd you come from? Where were you born and raised? What influenced you to become a scientist or whatever they are? And then how'd you come to write this book? And you end up with a lot of really interesting information.
Yeah, we live in a very strange world, Dr. Shermer. I think TikTok is a platform that limits you to 30 seconds to show your talents. And I'm not sure what are you going to do there.
I don't have any of those. The kind of talents that you see on TikTok, I don't have any of those.
They need to be quite physical by the looks of things. And you can't really display anything sort of intellectual in 30 seconds. So I do agree with you. I think kicking it back old school and having a good old chat about ideas is it will never die. I think. I hope so.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the question of quantum mechanics, because we've kind of talked about Roger Penrose and now invoking physics, our religious friends and families and folks are gone away from the ontological arguments and the Kalam cosmological argument, which is apparently it's been recently debunked by a lot of mathematicians and have come to say, well, that actually doesn't really work, WLC. But the issue of quantum mechanics is it's interesting. It's spooky, as named by the great man himself, Einstein. It's a little bit difficult to understand. It's counterintuitive, and it sounds awfully similar to something else that we call religion. Are they made to feel that way?
Well, I think it's just a science. It doesn't have anything to do with religion because, the tenets aren't accepted on faith at all. You have to, prove it, and it's been well proven. Okay, so, this idea that science is just another religion in a broader sense is a nonsensical idea. What do you mean by religion? If science can be a religion, then everything's a religion, which means nothing is a religion. These things have to have some kind of meaning. The words we use have to have some kind of specific meaning, or what are we even talking about, right? So I think what people are after is some sciences seem to bump up against deep questions. We've touched on a few: consciousness, free will, God's existence. Why are we here? What's the meaning of life? What was there before time began? And where the Big Bang stuff come from? What was there multiple bangs? Is it eternal? These kinds of big questions. It makes people think, wow, okay, that's the kind of thing that religious people talk about. So, yeah, okay, so what? Now at least we have the tools to get at some plausible answers, and some are going to be better than others. Well, how do you know? Because some have more evidence than others, or they're more mathematically elegant, I guess you might say, if they don't have any empirical evidence. It's just math, but there I'm out of my realm. I have no idea if a mathematical theorem is beautiful or not, because I don't even work in that area. So, but that kind of idea that, it looks to the average person like these guys are talking about deep questions, but it's really just kind of pushing the frontiers of science to see how far it'll go. It's much like the search for extraterrestrial intelligence or UFOs. To me, the whole thing smacks of religious kind of quest to find out our place in the cosmos and if we're alone or not. And the aliens are always portrayed as these super advanced moral beings far beyond our conception. And, that feels like a God-like search. And it's not, but it has a kind of a patina to it. and that's okay. It's kind of fun.
Indeed. So with the quantum mechanics, if we just look at a couple of phenomena, and then we can sort of compare them and say, well, is it actually that you're talking about? So Plato sort of proposed a world, a Platonic world, a perfect world that only exists in a different realm that we cannot experience, and we only see the shadow of that perfect world and a distortion of it. I think that has been completely falsified by science. That idealism type of philosophy is kind of gone. But then comes quantum mechanics and the duality of the nature of everything, and the fact that things don't manifest physically until we start looking at them. Otherwise, they are like more like a wave, so sort of something that is not physical, which is I disagree with, because I think wave and energy are still physical. That's the other side of matter. That's the as Einstein tells us in E equals mc squared. So it's still a thing. But they're saying, well, that wave is actually not manifested. It's not a table. It's not a chair. It's not a watch. So apparently the moon isn't there when you're not looking at it. What do you think about that?
I think the moon is there whether I'm looking at it or not, or even if there is not a single sentient being on Earth, the moon is still there. As far as I know, I mean, now I'm way out of my area of expertise, but as far as I know, the kinds of effects we're talking about here are at the quantum level, at the subatomic level, not at the macro level where people and eyeballs and moons exist, such that there is no observer effect at the macro level, short of some kind of bias. Like if people know that I'm recording them, then they're going to act differently than if they're not recorded. So social scientists have to have these kind of blind and double blind conditions, so subjects don't realize what conditions they're in, because that can influence them. But that's not what we're talking about here. So no, I know quantum physics is spooky and weird, and consciousness is spooky and weird, so they must be connected. No, there's just spooky and weird things. That's it. They may be completely independent of each other. By the way, John, I asked John Joe McFadden, because when we were talking about consciousness, this is on my podcast this week, what he thinks about Roger Penrose's and Stuart Hameroff's theory of consciousness, happening at the subatomic level in the microtubules, these connecting the structure of cells, neurons. And his answer was not much, and here's why. And then he explains in ways I can't repeat accurately, so just listen to that episode, why they're wrong. And it's like, okay, makes sense to me.
Well, I think we've got like 10 more minutes to go, and I think we've covered the three subjects, but then I want to sort of get the sort of the juice of your experiences over the years, because the topic of is there a God? I mean, it's a respectable question. We some people will laugh at that question and go, but deep down, we kind of would like to know, what is there a plan? Is there something outside of space time? Are we in a simulation? all these questions are up for grabs. They're good questions, so I don't think they should be laughed at. They should be argued respectfully and entertained, because they're quite interesting. I think Christopher Hitchens, in the most infamous conversation with Sam Harris, Dawkins, and Dennett, said to everybody's amazement that he would like the conversation to continue, and he doesn't want the religion thing to end, because he wouldn't have anything to argue about, and he loves an argument.
Yeah, I think that's just Hitch being clever. Maybe clever by half. He's such a great conversationalist. Of course, we would like to know if there's a God or not. And but my question is this: how would you know if you came close to encountering it, or some experiment, or how are you going to know? So here I just take this idea from Arthur C. Clarke: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and just extrapolate it out. Any sufficiently advanced extraterrestrial intelligence would appear to us to be omniscient, omnipotent, and therefore, deified in a way, a kind of God, or maybe the God. And but is that what Christians mean? No, they mean not just a really smart extraterrestrial, but something outside of the physical universe. Well, where's that? Outside of space and time. Where is that? There is no there. It's like what's the universe expanding into? It's not expanding into anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's just itself, its own space-time expanding, not into anything. And that's a limitation of just our cognition and our concepts and how we think about. We evolved to be to perceive a three-dimensional world, with a certain amount of gravity and so on. So, asking these questions, that are beyond that are very difficult to even grasp conceptually, which is why we have a hard time with quantum physics or even cosmology or the speed of light or dark matter. These are things that are not, our brains didn't evolve to quickly grasp in the, kind of African savanna that we evolved on. And, the idea that things can move the speed of light or glacially slow, like climate change or glaciers. We're used to seeing things move at, a couple miles an hour to a few tens of miles an hour at most. And, that the big objects maybe are like the moon and sun or something like that. But the idea of a universe that's 13.8 billion years across, just the radius. So double that for the entire expanding sphere, and then expand that even more because it's an accelerating expanding sphere. And then you get just kind of mind-boggling ideas that I don't even know how to grasp them. So we're just apes African apes trying to figure out these big ideas. And at some point we just can't grasp it. So, back to what if our brain was twice the size? Well, maybe we would, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, I don't believe in miracles, but if there's a miracle, the fact that we were talking about these things, while we should be saying what's for lunch, that's what we evolved for, it is a miracle that we were contemplating things that we have no right to speak about, let alone the world of the universe of the very small or the very, very large. It's amazing that we're talking about these things, but what about? I think the Abrahamic God, because of the inconsistencies, are just very blatantly obvious everywhere. But what about different kind of gods? What about Spinoza's gods, where the word is so ambiguous that he's everything and into everything?
Right. So maybe a deistic or pantheistic kind of God. There now, you're not far from just saying, well, the laws of nature are God. Maybe they have built into them, kind of front loaded into them, the complex world that can arise out of quantum effects and physics and gravity and natural selection, and all of a sudden you have a planet with complex life on it. Okay, but that isn't the kind of God most religious believers think of. They mean a personal agent, a being that itself is conscious and sentient, but more, and knows we're here, cares about us, created us. That's what most people mean by that. So you can go into the theological weeds talking about pantheism and deism and all that. It really doesn't matter, because 99% of believers, that's not what they're thinking.
Yeah,
they want something more, right? Obviously.
I agree.
So
sometimes I think Spinoza was preparing the world. I think he was. I think he couldn't say there was no God, and he said, well, God is everything. And Einstein adopted that God and talked about God doesn't play dice with the universe. But I think I'm in agreement with you that they're really talking about the laws of physics and the universe itself acting.
Yeah. I mean, it's possible that that something like that happened. I don't know. There's something outside of the cosmos that started it, or the laws of nature in different universes or different, bubble universes have different configurations in them. And some of them lead ineluctably because of the structure of the laws and matter and energy and so on. It leads to complex life and sentient beings, and others don't. But there's no reason to think that there's therefore a fine tuner. Just because it looks fine tuned to us doesn't mean there's a fine tuner, which implies an agent outside twiddling the dials to make this all come out a certain way. And then once you go down that pathway, then why the problem of evil? Why do bad things happen? If there's a deity twiddling the dials, why doesn't he twiddle them in a way that there's no more pain and suffering in the world? Why not that? And so anyway, but it's a fascinating question. There's nothing wrong with asking if there's a God and all that stuff. It's good. I mean, everybody should wrestle with it.
The very last question, Dr. Shermer, and the word of advice. As you know, I broadcast to a region in the world that the dogma is the order of the day. We're talking about heavily saturated religious communities and very nationalistic. You're surrounded by dogmas wherever you go. So either your country and your president or your religion. You've got very little space as a human being in those countries to think for yourself even for a second. And those who escape the velocity so they can escape the earth gravity and fly into space need certain speed to achieve in order to escape the velocity. What do they need to do as a word of advice to start breaking the shackles and the chains of dogma?
Yeah. Oh boy, that's a hard one. Well, it depends on which country you're in and what the social circumstances are. That let's just go back to what we were talking about. How many degrees of freedom you have politically, degrees of freedom politically or socially, or just in your social circle or your own family. Those can be very restricting to people. I feel sad, or I feel bad for people that write me and say, I can't come out as an atheist, or I don't believe, but I can't tell anybody because I'll get in big trouble, or I'll be disowned by my family or my social group, or in dictatorships and autocracies, you could be outed completely and sent to re-education camps or whatever, depending on the country. So that's not good. I would say don't risk your life over this kind of thing. Just do the right thing for yourself, but don't get yourself in a camp somewhere or lose all your friends and family. Although you have to ask yourself, to what extent does your family really love you if they insist you have to believe certain things or else? Well, that isn't what love is about. It's not contingent upon you being a Democrat or Republican or a Christian or a Jew. Otherwise, I'm not going to love you. Well, what does that really mean then, to love somebody, right? So just but the kind of things you're doing, there's people making books like by Richard Dawkins and myself and others available in foreign languages in these countries, and it's kind of a this sort of, call it the intellectual dark web, but it's not a web so much. Some of them are physical books. That's a good thing, and I think in the long run we'll get there. But in this case, it's going to have to happen from the top down, probably politically, with a separation of church and state, where people are free to be religious, but they should be free to not be religious also. And let people just decide for themselves. And most autocratic states don't want to give up that power. They just don't. There's something in human nature that once you have power, you don't want to give it up. Very few people do that. So,
Dr. Shermer, I would like to personally thank you. You have been one of the biggest influencers of my life. I've downloaded all your lectures from back in the 90s. And I've listened to every single one of them.
Wow.
They're actually available on Audible, guys. There's like 12 hours of lectures. It's absolutely brilliant stuff, because it's very spontaneous. You're in a sitting. It's a conversational. It's absolutely gold. So thank you so much for making me who I am right now.
Okay. Well, keep up the good work. I would say you're doing God's work, but that probably wouldn't.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed every second of it. Okay, folks, thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll chat to you later. Thank you.